Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. For your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and about whatever it is that we've decided to talk about. And tonight we're going to talk about the death penalty and anything else related to that. And I'm so proud of my guests tonight. I feel so good about them. Ron Steiner over here and Frank Thompson over here. They did a presentation at the Humanists of Greater Portland a 3 weeks ago about the death penalty. And I was so impressed, I begged them to come on the show and speak to you about what they talked about to the humanists. So, as you both know, we start our show off with this time we're going to start with Michael Mayo, who will do a cameo appearance in announcing his candidacy for the U.S. Congress. Now, what he says I may agree with and I may not agree with, but this is a Democratic show and we want his views out here. Take it away, Michael.
I want you to vote for me for U.S. Congress because I am promoting the values that you hold dear. We have had an empire in the United States since World War II. We have had a loss of civic rights since we've gone into illegal and unjust wars in Vietnam and in Iraq and Iran. I'm asking you to vote for me because as a person who refused the draft during Vietnam and spent 2 years in jail, I am a known quantity against war. And as for my opponent, Mr. Blumenauer, he is just another Democrat.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to my viewers.
I am honored.
You betcha. So let us start with our show now. And I am not as nervous as I usually am with the guests I've not been with before, but you're so easy to be with and so comfortable. I'm not so nervous now, but I'm always a little nervous. And how are you, Ron? How are you feeling now?
I'm feeling great, and it's a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Don.
Thank you. And Frank, how are you?
I'm doing well, and thank you for having us.
And I'm not going to stroke you about that baritone voice that I love anymore. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
So let's do the brief bio section. And if we finish that sooner, then we'll have a lot more time for you to talk about the death penalty. And there's so much to talk about, yeah. Let's start with you first, Ron. And when and where were you born?
I was born in western Pennsylvania, a coal mining area, a little town of Indiana, Pennsylvania, about 60 miles from Pittsburgh.
And when was that?
1939.
Oh
Yeah.
my God!
Yeah.
You got a couple of years. You're not as old as I am, though.
Yeah, well,
And anything significant about your cultural heritage that's worth telling the viewers about?
well, I'm like a lot of Americans. I was sort of a melting pot. My immigrant grandparents on both sides, Hungarian Jews on the one side, Italian Catholics on the other side.
Oh my
and,
God! What a mixture!
My grandfather on my father's side was a butcher, and my dad was a butcher, so I'm a son of a butcher.
Oh no! This is a family show now. Watch that. I love that. Yeah. And do you have a religious preference today?
I'm a practicing Catholic, and I guess practicing is the important word there. You know, I have a good faith, and I think it's important for me that I follow that.
I see myself as a recovering Catholic.
Yeah.
But I was an altar boy for years, and I was in doubt as to what's going on so much with you can eat meat on Friday and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I couldn't receive the sacraments before, and then they changed things. But then there's a lot that I got from my early upbringing as a Catholic altar boy that I don't want to lose. So, and being a humanist, I respect where you're coming from, and applaud it.
Thank you, thank you.
And
No, I think that we respect everybody else's traditions and feelings and faiths is a very important thing about being in this country.
What do you think of your new Pope?
I don't know enough about him to comment. I like his humble nature, the fact that he would rather take a bus than a limousine, send a signal that he's a man of the people.
Yeah.
But I don't know enough about him for his doctrine and things of that nature to comment.
I just had to ask that. It doesn't follow my usual format.
Yeah.
But and your formal education.
I have a bachelor's degree, and 1 year I went to law school back in Pittsburgh. While I was working a couple of jobs, I didn't last very long, but I have a 46-year career in the commercial television business, in the sales management, marketing part of television.
You don't have much to do with the cameras and this kind of
Not the
stuff.
technical things, that was not my field, but
Yeah.
I enjoyed that time, and it was a good experience to be there, and learned a lot about how to communicate through that experience.
So you don't have a regular job anymore.
I'm retired. I do volunteer work for our organization, Oregonians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. It's sort of a full-time job, but not for pay.
Say that again. The Oregonians for what?
Oregonians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty.
I want to hear that again. And you have a partner, a wife, a boyfriend,
I have a wife.
girlfriend,
We have
companion?
a blended family. We've got 6 kids, 12 grandkids. We're very family oriented. My wife comes from a very large family. She's one of 8. And it's a very loving family, and many of them live in the Portland area here.
I'm a baby of 12, and I'm not sure how loving it. No, no. When they get that big, yeah. Your political persuasion, would you characterize yourself politically or not?
I would characterize myself as a progressive. I particularly when we're talking about the death penalty, which we're going to talk about tonight.
Sure.
I don't like to characterize the Democrats feeling one way, Republicans feeling other ways. I think people come at this issue maybe from a progressive or a conservative point of view, but don't need to label them when we're having this discussion.
Yeah, there's labeling, and sometimes you need to use those so-called labels in order to have some sort of realization or impression
Well,
of where this person's coming from.
My preference would be progressive versus conservative.
I like that. And memberships in political, social, or civic organizations of any interest to our viewers.
Well, my time is pretty much consumed with this. I guess the last 15 years I've been involved in several different organizations, all of them working to help the disenfranchised. I worked in a transition program when I lived in New Mexico called the Dismiss House that helped ex-felons keep from reoffending. I've spent a lot of time on the board of directors with Habitat for Humanity, organizations like that, children's organizations.
You are a progressive, huh?
Yeah, I think it's pretty important that we try and help boost up people who have not had the same advantages that some of us have had. And one of the things that we kept talking about at Habitat for Humanity was it's not a handout, it's a hand up. And I feel that doing public service work should be characterized in that fashion.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think of any persons from the past or alive today that you particularly admire or look up to? Any names come to mind?
Well,
Other than Frank?
Frank I admire a lot. He's a relatively new friend, but he's becoming a good friend, and I admire him greatly. I don't know. I think my best answer to that is I admired my parents. They didn't come from any means. I admire some of my uncles who ended up being successful, but came from a rather humble background. People like that. If you're looking for world figures, I admire people like Gandhi and folks of that nature. But I think the people that I got to know intimately are the ones that I admire most.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of historical figures for me, and of course I've had a lot of time to practice this. And Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Che Guevara, and Hugo Chavez. But that's not fair because I've had a lot of years to prepare my response to that people I admired through the years. Yeah. Can you make me smile?
Can I make you smile?
You just did.
I did earlier. I did earlier with.
Let's move over to Frank now, can we?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. And how are you right now?
I'm doing good.
You heard all these questions.
I heard all of them.
Okay. And your full name is Frank what?
My full name is, I go by my middle name, Frank. My full name is Simon Frank Thompson.
Say that first name again?
Semon.
Where'd that come from?
I'm a junior.
Oh, and where'd he get Simon from?
His mother named, I think what really happened, she named many of her children out of the Bible. And she was attempting, as the family story goes, to name him Simon. And by the time he got off to school, it became spelled Semon. And it stuck. And he named his son Simon Jr. And you're looking at him. And I go by Frank.
Okay, Frank, yeah. And that looking at him, I can see how when you were dealing with some of those people, when you were a high up official in the prison system, you can be pretty
Intimidating?
Not really.
I don't know.
You know how to look at somebody.
I appreciate
I
that.
meant that
Thank
as a
you.
compliment, yeah.
Thank you.
Because if you see me really, then you see more than what's shown on my physical presence. if I may.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And when and where were you born?
1943, January 28th, month and day of, Damascus, Arkansas. That's a small, you know how it is in the rural.
Oh,
You
yeah.
claim the nearest post office box, but it's a small rural community, black community, just north of Little Rock, about 45 miles. 1943, I was born in a rural community.
Did you remember your childhood?
Very much I do.
Yeah, I do too. I was born and raised in New Orleans,
Okay. Oh, man.
back in the Depression.
Okay.
Enough of that. Let's keep going. We got stories
Yeah.
that'll go on forever.
Oh,
yeah.
man. We
Yeah.
could get into some stories, yes.
Yeah. Any significant things about your cultural heritage? You mentioned a few things about your being from Arkansas. Anything significant?
Most significant, well, there are. I was, my family had moved to Little Rock in the early 50s, and I was in Little Rock when Dwight D. Eisenhower federalized the troops, sent them to Little Rock
You were there.
to integrate Central High School. In fact, of the Little Rock 9 who integrated Central High School, I personally know at least 5 of them. So there's a chapter in this country's history that I'm very intimate and face-to-face with, and that was an interesting part of my life.
I'll bet you, yeah. A religious preference, you care to comment about that?
I'm non-denominational Christian. I grew up Baptist, have been Methodist for some years, but I'm non-denominational Christian.
I see myself as a Christian with a small c, and some people look at me and say, but you're a humanist. Christian with a small c, with a capital C, that means it's some particular sect of Christianity that Jesus would frown on nowadays. And your formal education?
Undergraduate degree in social work, did 2.5 years of law school, and I've done a number of hours in public administration.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Public administration, a lot of hours in that. Huh? Okay, we'll leave that go. I don't want to give enough time to talk about the death penalty. And you've been retired?
I'm retired now about 2 years. Retired here in Oregon from the Oregon Department of Corrections. I was superintendent of prisons. I came here as a superintendent of prison, and for 18 years, that's what I did.
What state was that in?
Well, prior to that, I was 10 years in the Department of Corrections in Arkansas. And then I did my 18 years here in Oregon.
Looking at me that way, can you tell about the time when I got a speeding ticket in Santa Ana, California, and they threw me in jail? I did 4 days. The
I
judge
can believe
said,
it. 4 days?
Yeah. He said, you know, you've been before me 2 times in the past 3 years, and it looks like you're not going to learn your lesson about speeding in my town. So I'm going to have you do some time, and maybe you'll learn. And I did.
Did you?
It's a little,
No more tickets in Santa Ana. at
oh,
least.
no. Those are another story, too.
Yeah.
And how do you spend your 2 years in retirement so far? What do you do when you retire?
Becoming increasingly involved with alternative Oregonians for alternatives to the death penalty, of course. I am visiting a couple of young people who are incarcerated in local institutions here. Other than that, I'm traveling back and forth to Arkansas, taking care of family business, visiting my granddaughter, who's 4 months old yesterday, and fishing, photography. But not doing any work for pecuniary gain at all, just volunteering.
With all that money you saved when you were working, you
I don't know
need to
about
work.
that. I don't know about that at all.
Yeah. So you have a partner, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a mate, or what?
Beautiful wife, Deborah.
Uh-huh.
We have a daughter, 25 years old, Chioma, and she just gave us this beautiful grandchild that I was talking about. Her name is Lexia, Lexia, and she's bringing a lot of joy in our lives. And my daughter's husband's name is Santana.
Are they going to be watching this show?
Well, I don't know that they can receive it in Arkansas, but you were saying that it's viewable nationwide, is it, or is it not?
Yeah, on my
Well, I'll see
website. It's on the card.
I will see to it that they know how to view it.
You want to tell them how you feel about them right now? I'm looking at camera 3.
How I feel about it?
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here. Invite a lot of people over and watch this show.
How would you characterize your political persuasion? You left, right, or center?
You know, I've always prided myself in being fairly independent. I resisted being labeled. Of course, my history probably has fallen on the Democratic side more often than anything else, but I like to be independent in my thinking about issues that face me in my life and my community.
I got a provocative question. When you say Democratic, is there a significant difference between the Democratic and Republican parties today in our country?
Oh, no, not really. Not really. The issues sometimes have fallen more on the labeled side of
The left or the right?
Yeah.
Conservative or liberal?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to see that change myself.
I'd like to see it changed.
Yeah, memberships in political, social, or civic organizations that would be of interest to the viewers.
Well, over the years, since having been here in Oregon, I have served on the board of directors of the Marion County Food Bank. I was on the Law Enforcement Contacts Committee, and that's a committee of individuals appointed by the governor to look into the issue of racial profiling by law enforcement. I was very complimented to have been a part of that because there were a fairly blue ribbon doctorates and lawyers and top level administrative officials who were part of this body.
Sure.
Toward the end of my working, I backed off a lot of my civic volunteering because I had become quite consumed with my job and volunteering. So I backed off, and I am incrementally choosing how to get more involved. And OADP is providing me with a lot of opportunities to stay civically involved in a very, very important challenge that I think it's worth being involved in, which is repeal of the death penalty.
Oh man, that's profoundly important.
Yes.
Yeah. Any persons alive today or from the past that you particularly admire to look up to? Any names come to mind?
As a Christian, of course, Jesus Christ.
Yes.
My parents, my father was quite the man. And today, because of my current involvements with the death penalty, I really respect and admire John Kitzhaber for the position he took in bringing about the moratorium on the death penalty. It befell me, as part of our program might reveal, it befell me to work with Mr. Kitzhaber in pulling off 2 executions. And I know the gentleman on a very close basis in terms of this whole issue about the death penalty, capital punishment.
He's our governor here in Portland.
He is our
John
governor.
Kitzhaber, yeah.
And for him to take a bold leadership stand like he did gets my admiration.
Yeah, yeah. If I were to ask your best friend, who is Frank? What would your best friend say in the first person? Frank is what?
That depends on the day of the week and day of the issue. Frank can be the life of the party. He loves humor. He loves music. Frank can be very passionate about causes. Frank enjoys traveling and loves family. God first, family next, and then some of the other stuff that I've just given you. But in large part, that's what they would probably touch on if they were to describe Frank.
So you got a lot of best friends, huh?
Well, I've got some friends who wouldn't mind describing me in those terms. I tell my daughter, if you go through life and you have two people who don't know each other that you can call your best friend, you're fortunate.
You bet. You bet. I just finished an opening invocation for the Oregon House. Next month I'm going to do the opening invocation because I'm also a humanist minister, among other things.
Okay.
And I talked about friends and friendship and the different levels of friends and friendship. And I was just working on it again this afternoon. And I think of acquaintances, strangers' acquaintances, friends, best friends, and precious, loving friends. That's a new category that I created myself. And I go on in my presentation describing what that's about. And at the end of it, I invite the House members to consider where you stand and with those kinds of categories in your friendships and acquaintances in your life. And do you see yourself as being open to having more
Wow.
good friends? Anyhow, off on my tangent now.
Yeah, that's
But maybe you watch it someday because it'll be on the internet too.
okay.
Let's continue on with you now.
Okay.
All right. So it's a little early to take a break. Let's take a break so we don't have to interrupt once we're into death penalty, and take a 2-minute break. Mr. Director, can we do that? He says yes. Thank you, Evan. Okay, we're back. Thanks for counting us down, Mike. For you viewers, who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of 1-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals, and about whatever it is we have decided to talk about. And tonight on this show, we're going to talk about the death penalty. And I'm looking forward to this part because these two gentlemen did a presentation for the Humanists of Greater Portland 2 or 3 weeks ago on a Sunday morning, and it was an excellent presentation about the death penalty and what's going on and a whole bunch more. But if I say anything more, I'll be disclosing what we're going to talk about from now on to the end of the show. So let's get started. My first question is, how did you two become so impassioned about the death penalty and that issue, pros and cons? What turned you on in your life to become so interested in that?
Well, my entry into this was in the year 2000. As I had mentioned earlier, I was on the board and working with this transition program for ex-felons to keep them from reoffending down in Albuquerque. And we had the good fortune to have Sister Helen Prejean, the author of Dead Man Walking, come and do a fundraiser for us. And she started to talk about our program for about 3 minutes and launched into her favorite topic, the death penalty. And she said some things that just struck me as, that's not fair. That's not justice. And I didn't know a lot about the death penalty. In fact, if somebody had asked me at that point in time, do you support a death penalty? I would have probably said yes. Based on people do terrible things, they need to be punished. Mm-hmm. But if they asked me the second question, why, I had no earthly idea. So I made it my business to start studying. I read her books, I listened to her tapes, I read a lot of other books, I went to meetings, and I found that the death penalty is full of failures. It's a biased system. It's not justice as far as I'm concerned, and it needs a lot of work. So I worked while I was living in New Mexico on the steering committee for the New Mexico Coalition to repeal the death penalty, and we were successful in 2009. Mm-hmm. And when I moved up to Oregon, I got involved up here, and since that time I've been spending an awful lot of time doing this kind of work.
Frank, what happened that got you so impassioned and so turned on to the death penalty project, so to speak?
I think a couple of things. Most of my life, since about, maybe let's say 13, I've been involved. I've been through segregated schools, and I was interested in the civil rights era, and I became involved in fighting those causes. As an older young man, I was a Vietnam era veteran, and after having gotten out of service, I became quite active in demonstrating against Vietnam, the Vietnam War. So there's been in me sort of a civic mindedness. Mm-hmm. I'm not bragging, but I was driven to become involved in dealing with social ills or political ills. That's just sort of in me. I never thought I would become as active in the death penalty issue as I am now, except for the fact that it befell me on a very personal and profoundly intimate level to conduct 2 executions. And it forced me to come to grips with where I really stood about the death penalty. The black population in this country is as conflicted about the pros and cons of the death penalty as you'll find most other groups. I mean, the black community has largely more crime perpetrated upon its communities than it. So there are a good number of black citizens who have, and maybe do today, support the death penalty. And I came up in that environment.
Sure.
Where the death penalty was not so far removed from being an appropriate sanction for some of the things that happened to us. Mm-hmm. But when it became my responsibility to train decent men and women on how to take the life of a human being in the name of a public policy that could not be shown to work, it forced me to really declare to myself, where do you really stand? And it was at the point, and fortunately at that time I was working for Director Dave Cook.
Director Dave Cook, was that?
Dave Cook, who was the director of the Department of Corrections at the time.
Yes.
And I told him I can do my job if I can speak out against it. And he, too, was against the death penalty. And John Kitzhaber was the governor at the time. So, of course, I did not soapbox and I didn't go out looking for an opportunity, but my staff knew that I was against the death penalty, and that was the genesis of me becoming more and more involved.
Interesting. Interesting. Let me see these questions here. What's the history of the death penalty in the U.S. and in Oregon? You talk about the history of it?
Yeah, I'd talk about it in the fact that it's been sort of a confused history here in Oregon.
How so?
The death penalty is a states' right issue. At the present time, there are 33 states that have a death penalty and 17 that do not. Recently, both houses of the Maryland General Assembly have voted to repeal, and as soon as Governor O'Malley signs that legislation, the numbers will become 18 and 32. But Oregon has had the death penalty, gotten rid of the death penalty a couple of different times. It's unique here in Oregon that it's part of the Constitution. Therefore, the only way to change the law is by a vote of the people. In all the other states except California, Florida, and Oregon, it can be done in the legislature. So here in Oregon in 1984, 1964, the death penalty was abolished by a vote of the people. And if you can remember the environment, the atmosphere in the 60s, it was all about protest and the protest against the war in Vietnam. The civil rights movement was in high gear, and there was a lot of progressive thinking, and people got rid of the death penalty. Well, 20 years later, the voters brought it back in. Well, that era was the Reagan era, tough on crime, politicians getting elected being tough on crime. So that all became a part of that. So in 1984, and since then, we've had a death penalty here in Oregon. The tide is changing dramatically. In the last 6 years, the last 5 years, there's been 5 states, New York, New Jersey, New Mexico, Illinois, and Connecticut, that have gotten rid of the death penalty. When Maryland becomes 6th in 6 years, that means the tide is continuing to change. Death sentences have been lessened. This past year we had fewer than we had in the last 2 decades. Executions have been lessened, even in states like Texas, which has the distinction or dismay that they execute a lot of people, have reduced the number of death sentences and executions. So the tide is moving in a direction that people are understanding more and more about the death penalty and the fact that it doesn't deter crime. It is not justice. It is not fair in its administration. And it's a public policy that we're spending an awful lot of money on without any benefit for the consumers. So it's a mixed bag here in Oregon, and I'd like Frank to talk a little bit about the most recent history, and that being his experience, having the background that he has. He was asked to go to Maryland to testify in their discussions and debate about the death penalty just a couple of weeks ago, and I think he'll be modest and won't say this, but he had great impact down there, and he should tell you about that experience.
Frank, will you?
I was really complimented to be asked, considered to be an expert in the field, so to speak, to testify before the judiciary in Maryland. And the thrust of my testimony was to address whether or not the death penalty is necessary in order to run fundamentally sound correctional facilities. And of course, my testimony indicated that the death penalty is not necessary. There are many proponents of the death penalty who have this overblown concern that if you get rid of the death penalty, then those that have been on death row are going to be released among general population, and they'll have an opportunity to kill again, and so that's far from the truth. Almost all correctional superintendents know how to run fundamentally sound correctional facilities if they are given trained staff, a good classification system, have adequate facilities to house all sorts, all levels of security classifications of inmates, and they have good line of sight between inmate themselves and inmate activities, you can run fundamentally sound institutions. And many people think that if we got rid of the death penalty, all of those on death row would be released from their cells. It might very well be the fact that most, if not all, of those persons will remain exactly where they are. They just won't be executed. They'll remain exactly where they are because of their security classifications. So that's the thrust, if you will,
Yes.
of my testimony, to address the concerns among some of the legislators that violent people will not be running amok among the inmate population, killing staff and killing other inmates.
Do they appreciate your testimony?
I read to Ron on the way down here a comment from one of the lobbyists who took me around to some of the legislators, and in his own words, he said that I was responsible for helping move some of the legislators to a repeal position against the death penalty.
That must have made you feel good.
One of the better feelings I can remember in my life.
Good.
One of the better feelings.
Digressing from our list of possible questions here, it occurs to me, how about the death penalty in other countries around the world compared to the death penalty in the U.S.?
Well, the death penalty's presence in the United States is something that is looked at upon by all of our allies as something that we're sort of goofy to have it here. Most of all the industrialized countries have abandoned the death penalty. The European Union, you cannot be a member of the European Union and have a death penalty. Canada doesn't have it, our neighbors to the south don't have it. So around the world, and pushed by the United Nations, the use of the death penalties goes down and down and down. The United States is in with a group of countries that we hear accused of violating human rights. Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Iraq, Iran, China, and the United States. Those 6 countries are responsible for 93% of all executions around the world. So we're sort of an oddball in all of the other framework that we call our friends, our international friends, that we have a death penalty. I have a son that lives in Switzerland, and the people in Switzerland think that we're crazy for having a death penalty. And I think we are too.
That was going to be my retort.
Yeah.
I do. I think so too. Let's see what our next question is. Who supports the retention of the death penalty, and what are their main arguments? I think you mentioned a few of their main arguments, people who support the retention of the death penalty.
People who support the death penalty largely believe that the death penalty deters. A good number of people support it because they feel that retribution is a just end of capital punishment. There is an organization regarding the deterrence element of capital punishment. There's a research organization, the National Information Center, National Research Center, which is held in high esteem as being probably the most balanced and thorough research entity that we have available in this country.
Sure.
And it has researched almost all of, it has studied almost all of the research supporting the death penalty, and it's come to the conclusion that the death penalty cannot be shown to deter crime. And it further stated that any public policy maker, decision makers, would be advised not to rely upon any of the studies that have been done to support the death penalty. So this makes the death penalty a failed public policy, and that helps refute some of the reasons that some people support the death penalty, such as deterrence.
So this belief in the general population about, in America, supporting the death penalty, why do you think they think this way? Is it what they're taught or what they learn from the media?
To a great degree, and this is not to denigrate people's intelligence, but they're uninformed about the facts. Some of the other reasons that people support the death penalty is they'll cite the Bible, things like an eye for an eye. So they find justification in individual quotes out of the Bible. Well, the Bible has a lot of things that had very terrible outcomes. If you talk back to your parents, if you stole a goat from your neighbors, they execute you. And that's not what the Bible's about.
The Bible also says love your enemy.
Absolutely, absolutely. The New Testament is all about love your enemy, forgiveness, reconciliation, move on, things of that nature. Other people are uninformed and say, well, I don't want to pay to keep those prisoners for the rest of their lives. Let's execute them. Well, they are uninformed about the cost associated with the death penalty. The death penalty is a very costly thing. Here in Oregon, we've had 2 executions in 50 years. Frank unfortunately had the misfortune of being in a command position during 1996 and 1997 when they occurred. But we spend taxpayers' money somewhere in excess of $28 million a year to maintain the system. And it's a system that doesn't even use the execution. People say, well, it's the responsibility of the state to carry out justice. Well, when it's unfair, biased against the poor and people of color, that's not justice. The iconic vision of justice is 2 cups that are equal. But if we look at who gets a death penalty, less than 2% of the people who get convicted of aggravated or capital murder in this country get a death penalty. And they are all poor, can't afford decent defense, and a high disproportionate number are people of color. So the fairness aspect comes in, and if what we've found, and our organization is all about education, since we have to change the law by a vote of the people, we're just trying to inform people, have discussion groups, have talks, have programs like this where people can learn about, or at least stimulated to think about and then learn about the death penalty. When the facts are known, it's a very difficult system to support. So the other groups that are vocal about this are prosecutors, district attorneys, and that's evidence. And I'm not saying prosecutors are bad people or anything, but prosecutors are in a position to convict people. They're taught in law school how to get wins. And having a death penalty, they will argue, a death penalty helps us get people to confess to lesser penalties, and it saves money. Well, unfortunately, some of those people that confess to lesser things have mental disabilities, and they'll confess to something they didn't even do. In this country, we've had about 1,300 executions since 1976, when they brought the death penalty back in the United States. We've also had 142 exonerations, people who served long time in death rows for crimes they did not commit. Eventually they found that they were innocent and then released. So that's 1,300 executions. For every 10 executions or 9 executions, there was 1 mistake that luckily was found. The problem is, how many were not found? What is the risk of killing an innocent person? We're pretty sure that Carlos de Luna in Texas was innocent. We're pretty sure that Cameron Todd Willingham in Texas was innocent. They were executed. So the system, we don't need a death penalty to keep the public safe, as Frank has testified all over the country now. But people want to keep hanging on to that as well.
Maybe this is a slight digression, but I've heard on the news recently that DNA has shown that this person on death row didn't commit the crime, and yet the authorities in that jurisdiction will not release them.
Yeah, in some cases. DNA is of the 142 exonerations, only 19 of them were because of DNA.
Right.
The majority of them, prosecutorial misconduct, hiding evidence, destroying evidence, bad judging, and insufficient defense. People who public defenders, because the accused cannot afford it, they get a public defender who maybe has never handled a capital case in their life and don't know the questions to ask, the objections to make, things of that nature. So the other thing about this, and I had an interesting conversation with a police chief. I'm not going to say what community.
Sure.
And the police chief, in our conversation, let it be known that he was not in favor of the death penalty. And I said, well, what about so many law enforcement people like the sheriffs are always on the side of let's continue the death penalty? He says the difference is I'm appointed, sheriffs are elected. So it's a very political situation here. Prosecutors are elected, sheriffs are elected. And I'm not saying they're bad people, but they support a system that we don't need. We do not need executions to keep the public safe.
Oh, Frank, you have anything more to say about that before I go to the next question? Because that makes me sad.
Yes. No, I think Ron has covered that very well.
Invite your viewers to watch the film West of Memphis. It's now playing in theaters around the country and in Oregon. And it's about the West Memphis Three young guys who are accused, convicted, sentenced, one of them to death, two of them to life sentences, and they did not do this crime. And it's all about hiding evidence, manufacturing evidence, judges telling people that they couldn't testify when they were good witnesses, things of that nature. And that happens too often. That's not American.
West of Memphis.
West of Memphis.
Is that available in theaters around the country now?
Yeah, it's showing in theaters now, and I'm sure it's going to be available on DVDs and Netflix, places like that soon.
Yeah, I'm going to be watching for it myself because it sounds like it's going to be interesting. Yeah. How do you respond to those arguments in favor death penalty as a deterrent? I think we covered that.
Yes.
What are the most compelling arguments for repeal when we're talking about the issues that resonate with Oregon voters? The most compelling arguments for repeal of the death penalty here in Oregon.
Well,
I think you covered some of them.
Yeah, the education of people is going to reveal things that are going to resonate with different people. But if you look at the research that's available, things that are most concerning are, number one, fairness. The opportunity to have everybody be protected by this, but not convicting people who are not there. The second one is the possibility that we would execute an innocent person. And that would be terrible. People say, well, it's the state's responsibility to do that. As Sister Helen likes to say, anytime we do that, we are the state. We all have our hand on the gurney. And Frank can talk eloquently about how difficult that is, and maybe he should, about how difficult it is for the staff to participate in something like that.
Earlier I alluded to it briefly that I don't feel that government should be involved in promoting any public policy that doesn't work, and to train decent men and women on how to take life in the name of a public policy that doesn't work, can't be shown to work, is immoral. When I was in Maryland, I was asked to read the testimony of Dr. Alan Alt. Dr. Alt was the director of Colorado's correctional system prior to going to Georgia. And he was to have been there to testify, but he could not be. And if I could read just a paragraph of his testimony regarding the very question you've asked.
Yes.
In part, he stated, men from all over the country have come to me for counsel, sharing stories of demons that haunt. I now speak out against the death penalty on behalf of the many who have participated in executions and have been traumatized by this experience. The trauma that many correctional officials endure at the hands of a state that forces them to participate in executions is often overlooked. There can even be a sense of shame. They are brave, strong individuals who devote their lives to keeping society safe and ensuring laws are followed. For many of them, it feels wrong to complain about having to carry out a law, even if the law harms them. Now, here in the state of Oregon, fortunately, we've not had any of our correctional professionals who would fit necessarily this description. But capital punishment is a public policy that's affecting a large part of the country. So I read this to give you a flavor of what is happening. It could happen here. We've been fortunate not to be a statistic in these regards. And he ends by saying, I can assure you that correctional officials don't need the death penalty for their safety. I can also assure you that there are many others like me who have suffered as a result of death penalty laws. If the only purpose for the death penalty turns out to be for society's revenge, then the old adage applies. If revenge is sought, one needs to dig 2 graves, one for the condemned and one for the executioner, because it will destroy you. Mine is a psychological grave. I wouldn't wish my nightmare on anyone. And this is from a former director of prisons in the state of Colorado.
That's a powerful, powerful testimony.
We wish he had been there, but they really appreciated that testimony.
Another thought comes to mind, I'm not sure we touched on it or not, is the people who are executed don't have a lot of money. How many very rich defendants or people accused of capital crime are executed?
And they don't get a death penalty. If you've got enough money, you don't get a death penalty. Only the poor get a death penalty.
There's something not quite fair about
that. The other area that we didn't talk about, that there's argument on both sides, is the people who defend the death penalty, and again, they have a right to feel this way, say that the victims need closure, the victims' families need closure. They need to have something to say that they can heal. Well, a lot of people who are involved with this process that we're going through, and I'm one of them. I serve on the National Board of Directors of Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation. There's a lot of other people who say, I'm a victim of this too. My family had the tragedy of losing a loved one. But another execution, another act of violence does not make me love them less, does not bring them back, does not make me forget about them. It does nothing to help me heal. It does not provide closure. They'll refer to closure as a myth. What they're striving for is reconciliation, the ability to move on with their life. We can never have a better past. And if they've had that in the past. There's a woman in Silverton, Oregon. Her name is Abigail. She serves on the board with Frank and myself. Mm-hmm. And she says she was so full of rage and anger at the beginning after her daughter was murdered. She said, this man not only killed my daughter, he's killing me too. And until she was able to reconcile and move into a space that she could let go of that anger, she was dying. And she now speaks all over the world. So the victims' families are a big part, an important part of this, and we have to be empathic to all of them, no matter what they feel about the death penalty, which we are as an organization.
What about the black people and brown people who are acutely aware of a huge disparity in the executions between white and people of color? What do you think they feel about it?
Well, go ahead. You can talk about that.
No, go ahead.
Just from an organizational, institutional thing, the NAACP is very much against the death penalty. Organizations like the Urban League of Portland, people of color as an organization are against the death penalty because they know about the bias.
Frank, any more comment from you?
No more.
Okay,
No
looks
more.
like we're going to wind down. Now it's almost time to stop visiting and get ready to say goodnight. Keep your pens and pencils handy. You may want to jot down something we'll show you in the closing credits. And thanks for watching and give us feedback because it helps us to give you a better show in the future. And my director says it's time for public service announcements. So what shall we tell the viewers about Mr. Director? Somebody, to watch my shows on the web. Go to my website, www.donbam.com. Click on favorite links. There's hundreds of shows on there from way back, and you'll find some interesting characters like these two guests tonight who are beyond characters. Thank you for coming on. and others, and the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. The American Civil Liberties Union protects our civil liberties, and I think they're in serious jeopardy nowadays with the direction that our country is heading. And to get my shows broadcast regularly by your local public access station in any part of the country that you're in, have them go to www.pegmedia and click on what you saw a moment ago. And to learn how to end corporate personhood, which we must end, go to www.movetoamend.org and learn how to help end corporate personhood. Corporations are not flesh and blood human beings. They're artificial creations that wield way too much power in this democracy that is America. And we have another one to tell you about. I'm supposed to thank you for watching this episode of Conversations with Dr. Don. And my favorite thought for the day, I got a surprise thought for the day for you. Let me see if I can find it here. Came by email the other day. I very quietly confided to my best friend that I was having an affair. She turned to me and asked, "Are you having it catered?" And that,
That's
my
good.
friend, is a definition of old. Reporters interviewing a 104-year-old woman, and what do you think is the best thing about being 104? The reporter asked. She simply replied, "No peer pressure." I think I'll quit when I'm ahead.
That's good.
Thanks again for watching. Remember KFC? Not Kentucky Fried Chicken. Dr. Don's KFC. Kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind. And be friendly and be charitable to you too. And to you too.
And to you too.
And you. And you in the control room. Good night.